June 12, 1916. 0220 hours. North of Beaumont Hamel on the Western Front. A cold mist clung to the mud and drifted over the tangled wire that marked the British forward sector. The sky held no moon. The only light came from distant artillery flashes that rolled across the horizon like slow pulses. The trenches smelled of wet earth, cordite, and weeks of unbroken strain. Every man along the parapet knew the silence never lasted. German night patrols moved through this terrain with practiced skill. They cut wire, scouted gaps, planted charges, and slipped close enough to kill sentries before anyone understood what was happening. Entire stretches of line lived in fear of the dark. It was the kind of fear that exhausted a soldier more than artillery ever could. Each step in the mud felt heavier. Each shadow felt sharper. Each sound held a threat. Private Arthur Jenkins crouched near a dugout entrance with a coil of salvaged wire over his shoulder. He wiped rain from his face with a gloved hand. He had the calm focus of a laborer who spent his life solving practical problems with tools instead of theories. Before the war he built sheds, stables, and cottage frames. He measured angles with sight lines and patience. He used leverage to move beams alone when other men needed two helpers. That skill shaped how he saw every battlefield challenge. Obstacles made sense to him. He did not fear them. He studied them. He broke them down into smaller problems until a solution appeared. The night infiltrations weighed on him. The Germans had slipped through the wire 3 times that week. 2 British sentries were dead. 1 section lost a runner in the dark. Every man in the platoon moved with tension that never eased. Arthur watched how the enemy worked. They crawled low and slow. They tested wire with gloved hands. They learned the rhythm of sentries. They used the fog as cover. He saw a pattern. He also saw a weakness. The British line had no reliable early warning. The men depended on sight and sound. Both failed when weather and fatigue joined against them. Arthur carried a wooden baseboard tucked under one arm. In his other hand he held a bent piece of scrap steel shaped into a spring. He reached the small recess beside the firing step that he had cleared earlier. It lay behind a sandbag wall where rain dripped in steady taps. He set the board on the mud, checked its fit, and ran the thin wire across a narrow gap where any crawling man would pass. The wire connected to a small latch carved from crate wood. The latch held a thin steel arm in place. When disturbed, the arm would snap forward and strike the surface of a circular saw blade he had scavenged from a shattered engineer crate. The sound was sharp. He tested it earlier. The blade produced a metallic shriek that pierced the fog. He secured the wire to a rusted nail hammered into a plank near the trench wall. He worked with steady hands. He checked tension. He checked angle. He checked alignment. His mind moved through each step with the rhythm of someone who spent years perfecting joints, hinges, and braces. The device was crude but reliable. Nothing about it depended on gunpowder or risk of unintended explosion. It was mechanical, simple, and loud. He believed it could save lives. Footsteps approached. Sergeant Clifford Hale stopped beside him. Hale was a strict adherent to regulation. He believed improvisation caused more trouble than it solved. He glared at the contraption with suspicion. "What is that, Jenkins?" Arthur answered without hesitation. "Perimeter alarm. Tripwire, sir." Loud enough to wake the whole line. Hale crouched and examined the blade with a scowl. "This is unauthorized. Engineering stores do not approve devices like this. If some fool stumbles on it, he will blame me for letting it stand." Arthur held his tone steady. "It will warn us before a patrol reaches the wire. The last 3 nights prove we need something reliable. They move better in the dark than we do." Hale shook his head. "We follow regulation. Remove it. No exceptions." Arthur felt frustration rise but remained respectful. "Sir, I tested it. It works. And it costs nothing but scrap. Remove it. That is an order." Hale moved on. His boots splashed through the puddled trench. Arthur stared at the device for several seconds. He knew the rule. He knew the consequences. He also knew the cost of doing nothing. The enemy would return. Another patrol would breach the line. Someone would die in the dark. Someone tired. Someone unlucky. Someone who trusted a system that was failing in plain view. He dismantled the device slowly. He set the blade aside. He coiled the wire. He packed the latch into his kit. Hale watched from a distance but did not linger. Arthur waited until the sergeant moved toward the company dugout. The night swallowed him. Arthur restored the device once Hale disappeared. He worked quickly. He reduced the number of alarms to 2 instead of 4. He placed them where the ground funneled any crawling infiltrator. He chose points where the mud formed natural low spots. He anchored each wire at angles that avoided accidental trips by his own men. He marked positions in his memory. He left no visual sign. Rain thickened. Visibility shrank. The night grew colder. Men on watch pulled greatcoats tight. One whispered that the Germans would return because they always returned after long silences. Arthur checked each alarm in the dark with gloved fingers. His touch was trained by years of carpentry. He felt tension changes. He sensed misalignment. He corrected each fault without sound. He believed a simple mechanism could stand between the platoon and another night of confusion. He believed sound could cut through fear. He believed a clang in the dark would give men a chance to breathe, raise rifles, and take positions before the first shadow reached the parapet. Arthur returned to his firing step. He rested his Lee Enfield across his knees. He listened to the wind pushing mist through the wire. He listened to the faint movement of water along the trench floor. He watched the fog hold its shape over the open ground like a low drifting sheet. He waited. The device sat 50 meters forward, hidden between stakes and wire. Its steel blade held tension like a coiled thought ready to snap. The night pressed deeper. The enemy had not yet come. But Arthur knew they would. June 12, 1916. 0340 hours. The fog thickened over the forward slope until the landscape lost all definition. Shapes blurred. Depth vanished. The trench lamps had been extinguished long ago. The men relied on touch and instinct. The Western Front punished anyone who trusted their eyes at night. Distance played tricks. Sound drifted in uneven waves. A single misplaced step could expose a silhouette against the dim sky. Every soldier learned the same rule. At night you moved slow, you breathed slow, you thought slow, and you waited. Arthur Jenkins stayed alert. He kept his rifle steady across his lap. His breath rose in faint clouds. He watched his sector through a narrow gap between sandbags. His eyes adjusted to the gloom until he could distinguish faint contrasts. He noted the darker ridges where the ground dipped. He observed the faint glimmer where puddles caught weak reflections from distant shell bursts. He knew the enemy scouts used those same markers. A careful infiltrator mapped ground with sight lines and memory. They learned where trenches lay by, studying the shape of debris and the angle of broken fences. They followed silence, not noise. The platoon felt pressure. 3 infiltrations in 1 week left every man tense. 2 soldiers whispered at the far end of the line. Their voices stayed low. One asked if the Germans aimed to probe again. The other said yes because the enemy always returned after rain. Wet wire made less noise when cut. Mud hid footprints. Fog hid movement. Conditions were perfect for a skilled patrol. Arthur had learned this pattern. He saw it in the timing of enemy activity. He listened to the change in distant machine gun fire. He noticed when the Germans chose to stay quiet. He tracked the rhythm of their mortars. Everything pointed toward another attempt. He leaned closer to the narrow firing gap and studied the terrain. The sound carried differently now. The wind slowed. The fog shifted weight. The silence felt deliberate, not natural. Experienced soldiers recognized the difference. Natural silence felt open. Enemy silence felt heavy. Arthur sensed that weight now. A corporal moved along the trench and spoke in a quiet voice. "Stay sharp. Something is off tonight." Arthur nodded. He thought of the device anchored forward. He trusted its tension. He trusted its alignment. He trusted its materials because they came from his hands. What? Wire. Steel. Simple parts working in reliable coordination. A tripwire was only as effective as its placement. He had placed it well. He watched the open ground. Nothing stirred. Minutes passed. The night seemed endless. A rat moved along the edge of the trench. Someone swatted at it with a boot. Another soldier cursed under his breath. The fog swallowed the sound. Then the horizon flickered with a distant artillery flash. The rumble followed several seconds later. The Germans usually shelled the British line before sending patrols. Tonight they remained quiet. That was unusual. It suggested a stealth objective. Sabotage. Wire cutting. Mapping gaps for future assaults. Something planned. Arthur rested his hand on the cold steel of his rifle barrel. His gloves felt damp. Mud clung to his boots. He tried to breathe evenly. Tension spread through the trench like a slow current. Every man sensed danger but could not locate its source. He leaned forward again and stared into the zone where he had placed the first latch. The fog made it impossible to see the device. He did not need to. If anything touched that wire, the saw blade would announce it. A faint sound reached him. It was not wind. It was not water. It was movement. Soft. Careful. Close to the ground. He narrowed his focus. Another sound followed. A low rustle. A fabric shift. A gloved hand brushing wire. It came from beyond the first low ridge. His pulse quickened. The infiltrators were close. The sergeant moved down the line, whispering reminders to hold positions and keep rifles low. Arthur did not mention his device. He knew the sergeant would order him to remove it again. He stayed silent. The sound vanished. The night swallowed it. Arthur held his breath. Then he heard it again. A light click. A metal tool scraping wire. The Germans worked with precision. They clipped wire with padded cutters. They moved in pairs. One man held tension, the other cut. They planned routes through gaps. A veteran patrol could reach a trench within minutes. Arthur gripped his rifle and stared ahead. His eyes strained to penetrate the mist. A new sound snapped through the night. A sharp metallic strike. Then the saw blade screamed. The sound tore across the dark. It bounced off trench walls. It echoed through fog. It carried farther than any shouted warning. Soldiers jerked upright. Rifles snapped to shoulders. Boots thudded against wood planks. Someone shouted, "Stand to." The device had triggered. Something had hit the wire. Something had released the latch. Arthur steadied his aim toward the direction of the alarm. A shape moved in the fog. Then another. Crawling figures froze when the sound erupted. The alarm robbed them of surprise. It forced them into hesitation. That hesitation cost them the advantage. The Germans recovered quickly. One scout fired a flare pistol. The flare arced upward, burned white, and filled the field with sudden glare. British riflemen fired on instinct. The flare exposed silhouettes near the wire. Two German infiltrators crouched low. One held wire cutters. Another carried a trench knife. They attempted to scatter. Arthur fired. The recoil pressed against his shoulder. His shot caught one of the infiltrators in the side. Nearby riflemen joined the volley. More silhouettes appeared as the flare light stretched across the mud. A German NCO shouted orders in clipped German. The patrol began to retreat. They had lost surprise. They had lost darkness. They had lost time. The British line erupted with rifle fire. Bullets tore through the fog. Muzzle flashes lit the trench. Machine gunners prepared positions. Officers shouted coordinates. The infiltrators sprinted back toward their lines. The Germans fired back in short controlled bursts. The firefight turned chaotic. Arthur saw one scout try to roll behind a broken fence post near the wire. He moved quickly. He worked the bolt and fired again. The man collapsed in the mud. The sergeant dashed to Arthur. His expression showed shock, then confusion. What was that noise? That alarm. Arthur did not look away from the field. My device, sir. It worked. The sergeant hesitated. He wanted to argue. He wanted to enforce regulation. But the proof echoed across the field. The sound had given the platoon time. The alarm had done what standard procedure failed to do. The firefight slowed. The infiltrators withdrew under covering fire from their rear guards. Rifle shots tapered off. The fog swallowed the retreat. The flare burned out and left the field dark again. Arthur kept his rifle raised for several seconds. He listened for movement. He heard none. The line steadied. Men caught their breath. Boots shifted. Barrels cooled. Several soldiers whispered that the alarm saved them. One said the Germans were nearly through the wire before it triggered. Arthur lowered his rifle. His arms trembled slightly. Not from fear. From the surge of tension released. He turned to look at the sergeant. Hale stared back, uncertain. He had witnessed something he wanted to deny but could not. His jaw tightened. He said nothing. He walked away. Arthur exhaled. The night was far from over. The Germans would likely adapt and return. But the device had proven its worth. It gave men warning. It broke the silence that killed them. He rechecked his sector. He rechecked his footing. He kept his mind clear. The saw blade still vibrated somewhere in the fog. June 12, 1916. 0415 hours. The flare had faded. The gunfire had stopped. The fog settled again over the dead ground, thicker than before, as if trying to erase the violence that passed through it. The trench smelled of smoke and churned mud. Men whispered about the alarm. Some asked who built it. Others said it was the only reason they were alive. Fear in their voices shifted to relief, then to something sharper. Respect. Recognition of a simple idea that worked when everything else failed. Arthur Jenkins stayed on the firing step. He did not relax. He watched the ground with the same steady calm he used at a carpenter's bench. German infiltrators rarely attacked only once. They sent probing teams. If the first Attempt failed, a second team studied the failure and adapted. Enemy doctrine allowed flexibility. British doctrine did not. That difference killed soldiers. The sergeant returned. This time he did not show anger. His voice stayed low. That sound carried across 3 sectors. Lieutenant wants to know what happened. Arthur answered quietly. Trip latch, sir. Wire pulled the arm. Steel hit the saw blade. Nothing complex. Hale looked uneasy. You disobeyed an order. Arthur kept his tone level. Yes, sir. Hale paused. He understood the weight of the moment. If he punished Arthur, he punished the man who saved the line. If he ignored regulation, he risked reprimand. He rubbed mud from his gloves and spoke again. Lieutenant will decide. Stay alert. Arthur nodded. Hale walked away with the posture of a man trapped between duty and evidence he could not ignore. Distant movement caught Arthur's attention. Something shifted in the fog beyond the far wire. He leaned forward. The shape was low and slow. He tracked it by sound. Crawling. Careful. Not an animal. He whispered to the man next to him. Contact. Same direction. The whisper spread. Rifles angled outward. The platoon steadied. Every man adjusted boots along trench planks. A corporal quietly readied a flare pistol. A machine gun team shifted their Lewis gun to cover the sector. Arthur watched the shape disappear, then reappear. The infiltrators moved with more caution now. They had heard the alarm. They expected more. This time they probed from a different angle. A wider arc. They wanted to test the perimeter and find unprotected gaps. Arthur thought of the second device he placed. It sat near a drainage dip, concealed by a line of torn sandbags and broken wire stakes. He had anchored the saw blade to a stable board and aligned the arm with careful tension. The device needed only a slight tug to trigger. He hoped the infiltrators would choose that path. The fog carried sound differently. Arthur strained his ears and listened for low friction, soft ground drag, or fabric brushing mud. He caught a faint scrape. Then silence. Another scrape followed. 2 crawlers moving slowly and in coordination. The voice of the lieutenant carried along the trench. Controlled. Quiet. Hold fire until confirmation. Arthur kept his eyes fixed. His breath stayed shallow. Moments passed. A sharp, metallic cry tore through the silence. The second device triggered. Men reacted instantly. Rifles steadied. The corporal fired the flare. White light surged overhead and flooded the field. The glare cut through the fog like a blade. 3 German scouts appeared in the open. They froze under the flare. One reached for a grenade. Another raised a pistol. Arthur fired first. His shot struck the man with the grenade. The soldier collapsed and dropped the explosive, which rolled into mud and fizzled without detonation. The Lewis gun team opened fire. Their stream of rounds forced the infiltrators toward the wire. Another shot from a different rifleman dropped the scout with the pistol. The third man crawled for cover, but his movement was slow under the bright flare. A British rifleman farther down the line caught him with a clean shot. The firefight stopped as quickly as it began. Silence returned. This time relief spread faster than fear. The men understood what happened. They understood why the patrol was exposed. They understood who built the device. The lieutenant moved toward Arthur. He was a stern officer, cautious, disciplined. He spoke with clear restraint. Jenkins, explain the mechanism. Arthur kept his voice steady. Tripwire. Release latch. Spring-loaded arm strikes a saw blade. Produces a sharp metallic alarm. It warns before infiltrators reach the wire. The lieutenant studied him. Simple. Yes, sir. Effective. Arthur waited. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. He stared into the fog where the infiltrators fell. Then he spoke. Regulation prohibits unauthorized devices. But regulation did not stop the enemy tonight. Twice. Arthur remained silent. The lieutenant looked along the line. We will not remove the devices. Not tonight. 2 corporals traded glances. One whispered that this decision would reach battalion headquarters by morning. Another said the higher command would shut it down once they heard of it. The lieutenant ignored their whispers. Arthur said nothing. He checked his rifle. He checked his sector. He felt the tension ease slightly but kept his body ready. He knew the Germans might send a full squad next. They often escalated after failed infiltration attempts. They would test weak points with force. The fog grew heavier. It clung to the wire like a curtain. The flare light faded. The night fell silent again, but the silence felt unstable. Soldiers shifted uneasily. The alarm had saved them twice, but the battlefield punished anyone who relaxed too soon. Arthur listened. The faint hum of distant artillery rolled across the lines. He heard boots adjusting on planks. He heard a man cough. Then the night settled. He lowered his chin and scanned the terrain. His eyes followed the invisible paths infiltrators always used. He tracked lines of shadow. He evaluated every approach angle. This was how he built sheds and barns before the war. He examined pressure points. He located vulnerabilities. He reinforced weak joints. A battlefield was not different. Only the stakes changed. The lieutenant stood near Arthur again. He spoke in a quiet tone meant only for him. A device like this, if placed across the brigade frontage, could change the night war. Infiltration thrives on silence. You broke their silence. Arthur replied without ego. I used what I know, sir. The lieutenant nodded once. Stay ready. He walked off to speak with the sergeant. Minutes passed. The fog thickened further until visibility dropped to 10 paces. Men shifted uneasily again. A runner arrived with information from a neighboring company. Their patrol reported hearing German groups assembling beyond the ridge. More movement than usual. More foot traffic. Possibly a larger raid forming. Arthur adjusted his grip on his rifle. This was the escalation he expected. 2 failed infiltration attempts signaled a pattern. The enemy wanted to breach the line tonight, not just test it. They needed a gap. They needed surprise. They had lost both twice. Arthur checked the angle of his firing gap. He steadied his breathing. He reassessed the ground. He locked every detail in his mind. A muffled thump echoed from the distance. German mortars. Another thump followed. Then another. The barrage intensified. Shells landed 50 meters behind the British trench, targeting communication lines and support positions. Standard pre-raid tactic. The enemy intended to blind the defenders. The lieutenant shouted orders down the trench. Stand to. Prepare for assault. Hold positions. Arthur felt the tremor of shells vibrating through the boards. Smoke drifted over the trench lip. Men crouched low and braced themselves. The enemy shifted from stealth to force. The alarms had stopped them earlier. Now they planned to break through with speed. Arthur steadied his rifle. His jaw tightened. The real attack had begun. June 12, 1916. 0448 hours. The German mortar barrage intensified until the ground shook in timed pulses. Shells struck behind the front trench to disrupt reserves and sever communication lines. Smoke drifted through the air in dirty sheets. The fog mixed with it and created a thick, choking haze that reduced visibility to almost nothing. The British line braced for a direct assault. Every soldier understood the sequence. Mortars first. Confusion next. Then the infantry pushed through the gaps. Arthur Jenkins stayed on the firing step. He watched the front slope through the same narrow sandbag gap he used all night. The blast waves rattled the boards. Mud splashed against his boots. The smoke rolled along the trench wall and settled in layers. He stayed focused. His breathing stayed controlled. He knew the enemy wanted chaos. He knew they hoped the alarm system would be useless under heavy fire. He also knew something else. Stealth patrols avoided sound. Assault teams used it as cover. He leaned forward and studied the terrain. The wire looked like a faint dark line under the shifting haze. Beyond it, the slope dipped then rose again. He could not see movement yet. He listened. Mortars drowned most sound, but between the thumps he caught something faint. Boots. Heavy. Coordinated. The lieutenant shouted down the trench, "Hold steady. Wait for shapes. Do not waste ammunition." His voice stayed controlled. Calm tone under pressure signaled experience. Arthur kept his rifle ready. He evaluated angles. The first device had already been triggered and remained silent. The second device stood waiting. It held the last advantage they had before contact. The barrage slowed. Mortars shifted farther back. That was the signal. The enemy planned to move in. Arthur's jaw tightened. His eyes worked to find contrast in the fog. A corporal near the end of the trench hissed, "Movement." Everyone froze. Arthur saw it too. A dark mass materialized through the fog, low to the ground, then split into 3 narrow shapes. They moved in a line. Assault troops. One carried a wire mat to press down barbed wire. Another carried grenades. The third kept low with a rifle ready. They approached from a new angle, farther left, searching for an opening. Arthur steadied his aim. He wanted them closer. Enough light to confirm. Enough certainty to avoid wasted shots. The shapes crawled. They reached the ditch line. Then it happened. A sharp metallic scream sliced through the haze. The second device triggered. The sound cut the battlefield noise in half. It rose above the mortar echoes. It pushed through smoke. It hit hard and clear. Every soldier snapped alert. Rifles aligned. Boots dug into muddy planks. The alarm gave them seconds. Those seconds mattered. Arthur saw the infiltrators freeze. Their discipline broke for an instant. That instant saved the line. A flare shot upward from the corporal. The ground lit in harsh white. The glare exposed the team fully. Arthur fired first. His round struck the scout with the wire mat. The man collapsed and rolled into the mud. The remaining infiltrators tried to scatter. Machine gun fire erupted from the Lewis team. The rounds tracked across the field and forced the Germans toward the broken fence where cover barely existed. More shadows appeared behind them. A full squad of German assault troops. 10 men at least. They intended to exploit the gap once the crawlers cleared it. But the alarm shattered their timing. Instead of breaching a silent perimeter, they ran headfirst into a ready rifle line. The British trench erupted with controlled fire. Arthur worked his bolt with steady movements. His shots found targets at medium range. 2 assault troops dropped. Another stumbled and fell. The machine gun team adjusted fire and suppressed the rest. The lieutenant shouted, "Hold the line. 2 o'clock. Keep your spacing." Arthur adjusted his aim toward the right. More silhouettes approached through the fog. A German NCO shouted orders from behind the main group. Arthur saw muzzle flashes and heard the sharp crack of Mauser fire. A British rifleman beside him ducked low and cursed. A bullet tore into the sandbag above his head. Arthur fired again. His round struck the NCO. The man fell backward and disappeared into the fog. The firefight intensified. Grenades exploded near the wire. Mud and metal fragments flew through the air. A shock wave hit Arthur's arm. He kept his stance and stayed focused. The flare burned out. Darkness returned. But the enemy momentum was gone. They had expected surprise. They received a wall of coordinated fire instead. More British riflemen joined the line. A second machine gun fired from a neighboring sector. The Germans attempted to retreat. Their withdrawal was clumsy. They carried wounded. Their formation broke. They moved without cover. Arthur fired again. Another soldier dropped. The Lewis gun tracked the retreating group and sent a line of fire across their path. A final grenade rolled and detonated near the wire. Then silence began to crawl back over the field. The lieutenant raised his hand. "Cease. Watch the ground. Hold position." The shooting slowed to nothing. Arthur waited. He kept his rifle trained. He listened. He searched for signs of renewed movement. None came. The Germans had pulled back. Their assault failed. Smoke settled. Fog swallowed the bodies near the wire. The metallic shriek of the alarm still echoed in Arthur's mind. That sound had altered the course of the attack. Without it, the infiltrators would have cleared the wire in silence. The assault squad would have entered the trench by surprise. Casualties would have been heavy. The line might have broken. The sergeant approached Arthur again. His face showed a mix of disbelief and reluctant respect. That was the difference. Without that sound, they would have been in our laps. Arthur said nothing. He kept scanning. The lieutenant joined them. Mud covered his coat. Smoke stains marked his collar. He looked at Arthur for several long seconds. "Your device gave us time. Twice. I cannot ignore results." Arthur waited. The lieutenant continued. "This will reach battalion. They will decide if they want more of these. But for now we keep them in place." A soldier farther down the line shouted, "Movement!" Every rifle snapped up again. Arthur felt his pulse rise. But the shape turned out to be a wounded German crawling back toward his own lines. He dragged himself through the mud. No one fired. The lieutenant ordered the men to hold. The man disappeared into the fog. Arthur lowered his rifle again. The trench fell quiet. The sergeant spoke in a thin voice. "I never thought a saw blade would save 30 men." Arthur answered calmly. "Steel makes noise when hit right." Hale nodded once and walked off. His posture changed. Less rigid. More aware. Arthur stayed at his post. His hands rested on his rifle. His mind replayed every detail. He considered improvements. Stronger spring. Better anchor. Dual strike plates. Weather-resistant cord. He worked through the mechanics in silence. He was a carpenter. He built solutions. War only changed the materials. The fog thinned slightly. The ground beyond the wire remained still. But Arthur knew the night was not finished. German doctrine demanded confirmation. They would reassess. They would adapt. They would test the line again. Maybe not tonight. Maybe tomorrow. But they would return. The alarm had changed the equation. And the enemy now knew it. June 12, 1916. 0517 hours. The fog began to thin across the forward slope as the sky shifted toward the first pale hint of morning. Light struggled through layers of smoke and mist. It revealed broken wire, scattered equipment, and uneven patches of mud where bodies lay half buried. The battlefield felt drained but tense, like a wound that had not closed. The German assault had failed, but the soldiers in the British trench knew the night had not ended. Dawn only changed the shape of danger. Arthur Jenkins remained awake, alert, and motionless on the firing step. His eyes swept the ground with careful precision. His muscles ached from the long hours, but he ignored the discomfort. The alarm devices had already done more than he expected. They triggered early, they broke infiltration attempts, and they forced the enemy into a desperate assault. The trench held because the alarm destroyed the German timing. But Arthur knew something else. A smart enemy officer would study the failure and react before daylight. Their doctrine rewarded adaptability. Their scouts learned quickly. A final push could come before visibility became clear. Rain tapped lightly on his helmet. He scanned the wire. No movement. The mud beyond it looked flat, untouched, and cold. The silence felt heavier than before. The lieutenant moved down the trench, his coat soaked with rain and smoke. He stopped beside Arthur. "Your mechanism bought us the entire night." Arthur nodded once. He did not add anything. He knew the lieutenant was not finished. "We will reinforce the wire at first light," the officer continued. "We send patrols to confirm the point of break. But before we do that, the brigadier wants details." Battalion headquarters received the report. They want to know how a private in a frontline trench solved a problem their engineers could not. Arthur kept his tone level. "I used what was available." The lieutenant studied him for a moment. Arthur's hands were still. His eyes remained on the field. He looked more like a craftsman examining a faulty beam than a soldier recovering from a night of combat. "You built it because the night infiltrations bothered you." Arthur answered with a quiet certainty. "They cost lives." The pattern was clear. The dark gave them advantage. "We had nothing that forced sound at the right moment." The lieutenant nodded slowly. "That is the kind of thinking we lack." Before Arthur could reply, a shout came from farther down the line. Movement left sector. 50 meters beyond the wire. Rifles snapped into position. The lieutenant crouched and raised his field glasses. Arthur angled his view through the sandbags. The movement was faint. Slow. It did not match the earlier assault teams. The fog pushed shapes out of focus. Arthur adjusted his sight. A single figure crawled through the mud. Not forward but sideways. A wounded German scout. His uniform was soaked. His legs dragged behind him. He struggled to pull himself across the ground. The lieutenant whispered, "He is still alive." Arthur kept his rifle steady. The scout posed no threat. He was too weak to fight, too far to reach the trench, and too injured to crawl back to his own lines. The soldiers held their aim but did not fire. The battlefield had its rules. Killing wounded men did nothing to secure ground. The scout stopped moving. His head lowered to the mud. The fog swallowed him. The lieutenant lowered his glasses. "Hold fire." The men relaxed their rifles but stayed alert. Arthur looked at the scout a moment longer. Then he turned his attention back to the ground. The silence returned. This time it carried finality. The enemy had pulled back to regroup. The last wounded man had fallen. The line belonged to the British until a new attack formed. A runner arrived from battalion headquarters. He carried a message tube and looked exhausted from navigating the bombardment-scarred rear positions. He saluted the lieutenant and handed over the note. The lieutenant read it, then nodded. "Jenkins. Battalion wants a demonstration. They want the mechanism brought to headquarters at 0700 hours. Arthur did not react. "Yes, sir. You will come with me. They want your explanation." Arthur nodded again. He checked his rifle and slung it over his shoulder. He waited for the lieutenant's next order. "Stay here until dawn breaks fully. We need full visibility before anyone leaves the trench." Arthur resumed his position. He listened to the shifting wind. The fog thinned further. The first hints of gray-blue sky appeared above the shattered trees in the distance. Within minutes, soft daylight exposed the field. It revealed the damage clearly. Broken wire. Craters. Fallen soldiers. Bent stakes. Scattered weapons. The alarms had revealed every infiltration point with brutal clarity. The ground showed how close the enemy had come. 2 British stretcher teams moved out to collect wounded. The lieutenant organized observation posts to watch for long-range enemy snipers as the fog lifted. Orders echoed quietly along the trench. Men repositioned. Rifles rested on parapets. Tension settled into a slow rhythm again. Arthur stepped down from the firing step and approached the first alarm device. He examined the saw blade where it lay half buried in mud. The metal bore a fresh scuff where the spring arm had struck. The board remained stable. The latch mechanism stayed intact. The device had functioned exactly as intended. He brushed mud from the surface and lifted the wooden base. The wire remained taut. The latch required no repair. The strike arm still held tension. He dismantled the device methodically. He moved to the second one, which had taken heavier impact during the larger assault. That device showed signs of stress. The saw blade was cracked at one edge. The board had splintered. He collected the pieces and placed them in a satchel. The lieutenant approached again. "Ready?" Arthur nodded. They followed the communication trench toward the rear. The ground was slick from rain. Runners pushed past. Medical teams moved ashen-faced wounded toward dressing stations. Engineers carried coils of wire and repair tools toward the forward sector. Smoke drifted in thin lines across the landscape. As they reached battalion headquarters, a young officer directed them into a timber-reinforced shelter. A table stood at the center. Maps covered the walls. A brigadier, 2 captains, and an engineer officer waited inside. The brigadier spoke first. His voice was direct. "You built an unregulated device. You used scrap without authorization. You violated field engineering procedures." Arthur stood straight. "Yes, sir." The brigadier paused, then continued. "Your violation saved the line." One captain leaned forward. "Explain the mechanism." Step by step. Arthur placed the disassembled device on the table. He kept his explanation precise. He described tension, trigger force, angle of strike, sound amplitude, and material choice. His tone stayed calm. He spoke as if he were describing a wooden hinge or a stable door joint. The officers listened intently. The engineer examined the saw blade and nodded. "This is simple, reliable, adjustable, no explosive risk, weather-resistant enough for short rotations." The brigadier looked at Arthur. "If we approve these, can you instruct others to build them?" "Yes, sir." The brigadier exchanged glances with the officers. "We will test them across the brigade frontage. If results match tonight's performance, we adopt them permanently." Arthur raised his head slightly. "Understood." The brigadier added, "You forced the enemy to abandon stealth. That changed the entire tactical environment. Few innovations. Achieve that." Arthur did not smile or react. He waited for the next order. "You are to build 10 more today. Use whatever scrap you need. Engineers will supply wire, blades, and boards." Arthur nodded once. The brigadier dismissed them. Outside the shelter, the lieutenant exhaled. "You changed something important tonight. The army will not admit it quickly, but you did." Arthur looked toward the front line where fog drifted and smoke still rose. "I built what was needed," he said. The lieutenant nodded. "Sometimes that is enough."